1 Peter chapter 2, beginning of verse 13. Now again, I love context. Context is an important thing. Before we get to 13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Verse 12, keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, in the thing in which you are, they slander you as evil doers. As evil doers, they may, on account of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. So, please notice right here, doers of evil, and then we have kalon, ergon, good works. Just as we had in Romans chapter 13, the question of the definition of good and evil, right and wrong, what is morally good, what is morally evil, is right in the context itself. And part of Peter's exhortation is going to be, you're going to experience persecution, you're going to be slandered. Katalaleo, to speak against, slander. You're going to be slandered. And so if they're going to accuse you of evil doing, your life should be a life of doing good. Now, what if you're in a situation where a culture has been so given over by God to evil, the majority of people decide that that which is good is actually evil, and that which is evil is actually good? Then you have to entrust yourself completely to God to vindicate you. But you don't change your standards just because of that. That would be foolish. So, here's the section, verse 13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution. And when he says every human institution, he then gets a little bit more specific. Whether to a king as the one in authority. So the basileus, the king, as the one having authority, same word group that we had in Romans chapter 13, or to governors, so derivative authority, as sent by him for what? The punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. So, the punishment of evildoers, we had doing good up above, right? We had good works up here. Now we have evildoers. And to the praise of agathapoion, those who are doing good. Same context as Romans 13. Same idea as in Romans chapter 13. So when we talk about subjection, we're talking about subjection to those who are using God's standard of good and evil. And therefore, no anarchy. Nothing like it whatsoever. It's the exact same context. Punishment based upon what? God's law revealing what is evil and what is good. Now, here's a key. And this could be interesting, but need to do it because this is the other thing that we want to utilize this for. I'm going to put this up here for a moment, and I'm going to use this part of the board to do some writing. So here is the what we must be thinking about. Okay, number one issue. Who defines good and fall over himself? That would be great. Who defines good and evil? Who defines good and evil? Are we to believe, is there any reason for us to believe that either Paul or Peter believed that the actions of kings, governors, are to be taken by Christians as the ultimate determiner of good and evil? Do we have any reason to believe that? Well, let me give you an example in Peter's life that I think very clearly demonstrates the answer. Look at Acts chapter 13. We've discussed this before, but let me just remind you if you haven't seen it. In Acts chapter 13, Herod arrests Peter, and he's already taken care of James, and so he sees that that was very popular with the Jews, and so he's going to execute Peter as well. What happens? God supernaturally delivers Peter from prison. Basically, angel comes. It's a supernatural situation. I mean, when chains fall off of hands, that's a supernatural situation. When Roman guards don't see what's going on, when their prisoners walking away and doors are opening on their own, supernatural situation. So there's a supernatural deliverance of a real person out of a real Roman prison. He is led down to the street. The angel leaves him there. He goes to where he knows the Christians are going to be meeting. We have the funny story of Rhoda and Peter knocking on the door. This is one of my favorite biblical stories. It really, really is, which is why I don't suggest naming any of your kids Rhoda. But Rhoda, God bless Rhoda. I'm looking forward to meeting Rhoda someday. And I'm not sure that she ever found out that her name was put in Scripture in this way, But she leaves Peter standing outside, doesn't open the door, runs inside. Peter's angel is at the door, and they finally let Peter in. What does Peter do? Because if a common interpretation of Peter's own writings in 1 Peter chapter 2 is that we are to be subject to every human institution, a human institution had determined that Peter needed to be in jail. And God had just delivered him from jail. And Peter does not go, Lord, I had already started composing my first epistle in my mind, and I'm going to tell everybody they need to be in subjection to every human institution. So I'm just going to go back and surrender myself. And besides, everybody knows that if I'm not there in the morning, those poor guards, they're toast. They're going to be dead. And they were, by the way. They were executed. Is that what Peter did? No. Peter leaves a message for James and hotfoots it out of there because he knows God has delivered him. That means God has other purposes, and God's purposes are more important than an evil ruler's purposes. So whatever you do with what 1 Peter chapter 2 says, remember how Peter dealt with this. Remember how Peter dealt with this situation. And remember that at the end of Acts chapter 13, Herod himself, a king, king, same term, king. A king, God strikes him dead. Worms eat him. Doesn't sound like a good way to go. I don't know about you. I'm not really sure exactly how it happened, but it was probably not pleasant. Probably not pleasant at all. So here's the point. In all of Paul's writings, in all of Peter's writings, and all the rest of the New Testament, what is the ultimate source of knowing what is good and evil? It is God in creation and in special revelation in his law. Absolutely, positively, no question about it. None. So what has been the presupposition in most of the traditional interpretation of Romans 13 and 1 Peter chapter 2? There has been this subtle insertion of a presuppositional idea that if the government says it is agathos, then it's agathos. That's not what either text is saying. Either text is saying honor the government that promotes the agathos, the good, and that punishes the kakos, the evil. But nowhere are they saying it is government's role to determine what is agathos and kakos. So there has been a fundamental misinterpretation at that point, and a lot of it came from those times when that sacral relationship between church and state existed, and it was the king didn't mind if people assumed that it worked that way. I mentioned in the sermon Sunday night, a little something I had picked up from Gary DeMar that I was unaware of. But I knew, everybody knows, that King James hated the Geneva Bible, the 1559 Geneva Bible. The primary reason was it had all these notes, and these notes talked about how kings were under the authority of God's rule and God's law. And it even described people as tyrants. Tyrants. It's interesting, if you look up the word tyrant in the King James Bible, it won't appear. The king wouldn't allow them to use the term tyrant, even though there are places where in other translations it does appear. They would not allow the utilization of that term in the King James Version of the Bible for that reason, for that very reason. And so it is very plain that God's law defines good and evil, and that government, therefore, is subject thereto. And one of the main reasons for that is that everyone in a government is created in the image of God and therefore is subject to what God says in his law. So here you have two texts, and now the tough question comes. Now the tough question comes. What happens when government abandons any meaningful commitment to even a theistic worldview and becomes a promoter of evil? What is the Christian's duty? That's the first thing. You can pretty much see what my answer already is going to be to that. But here's where it gets even more difficult, and this is where we're having so much division today in the church. What about those issues and those topics that are not a direct discussion of what is good and evil? Let's make an application, and it's the application that everyone's thinking about and everyone's arguing about. It's dividing churches, and it is masks. Masks. There's nothing about masks in Scripture. I don't think you should go to the section about seeing God with unveiled face. The veil that Moses wore was not a mask. It had nothing to do with disease. It had to do with hiding his face from the glory that he had sort of been shaken off on him, you might say. He had absorbed from being in the presence of God. Scriptures never address the issues of pandemics as we have today. The Scripture does address disease. The Scripture addresses quarantine. Those who are to be quarantined are those who are sick. It is appropriate to social distance in that sense. There is no basis for accusing people of being sick until they are. But the idea specifically of masks is not addressed in Scripture. And so a lot of people think it's simply a matter of freedom to be determined by individual fellowships and churches. Okay. Then you have the reality of mandates from the government, where the government now says, well, you may have, we don't normally have this many, but we have between 650 and 700 people in our service on Sunday. You may have 700 people in your church, but you can only have 100 meet at any given time. And you all have to wear masks, and you cannot sing. Now, I know all of the alleged medical reasons why this type of argumentation has been made of late. I do. I'm not proclaiming myself a medical expert, but I did finish all the work for a Bachelor of Science degree in biology, and I've kept reading in that field, and I can read technical papers and understand what they're talking about. I have the vocabulary, and so I am aware of the argumentation. But here's the situation. What is the relationship between masks in Romans chapter 13 and government mandates? Now, I can tell you that in our fellowship, we have certainly not prohibited anyone from wearing a mask. If someone wants to wear a mask, they can wear a mask. If that makes them feel better, that's fine. But likewise, we have not mandated masks. We have left it up to the individuals to self-govern. Pretty much the only major things that we have done since March, for a period of time, we did not pass the offering plate. And we continue to, in our fellowship, we come forward to receive the bread and the wine and partake of it in that way. I think that's a beautiful thing. Why? Because you're actively proclaiming your faith. We're told in Scripture we're proclaiming the Lord's death until He comes. Well, when I go forward to receive the bread and the wine, I am actively doing so. I think there's something beautiful about that. It's new in my experience, in my history. You had always sat there and it was given to you, passed down the row. I like going forward. I like this way of doing it. What we do is we have either some of the elders or normally some of the deacons in the back with hand sanitizer. And so we take advantage of that rather modern innovation. And so before you come forward, you've gotten your hands sanitized, and so there you go. Those are really the only things we've done. For a while, we stopped coming forward during the last song of the service, which had been our tradition, but we've begun doing that again. There has been no social distancing in the sense of 6 feet or 3.5 feet or 4.5 feet, depends on which country you're in as to what the number is. That's a magical number. It just sort of popped out of the air. We've not done any of that. And in fact, the building we're renting is a little bit smaller than what we need. And so there you go. There's where we have come down. And so people would say, well, no, if you're not masking, you're not showing love for neighbor. And didn't you have love for neighbor in Romans 13? Is that loving, not loving neighbor? Okay. Let's remember a few things. I'm going to see if this works. I'm not sure if it's going to. Here is Dr. Fauci back less than a year ago, March of 2020. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask, infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci told 60 Minutes on March 8th, 2020. And now, this is January 25th, so yesterday, Dr. Fauci, double masking makes common sense and is likely more effective. All right. Well, which one is it? Well, some people would say, well, all the science has changed. No, the science hasn't changed. In fact, every single study I've seen that's actually a peer-reviewed, published study has established the same thing that was true back in March and that all these people knew back in March. All right? So the position that we have taken in regards to this subject is basically based upon the same principle enunciated by Alexander Solzhenitsyn years ago when he was about to get kicked out of the Soviet Union. Live not by lies. Live not by lies. That is, all the science that I've been able to find, and I've had a number of people who've tried to challenge me on this, and when I've pushed on them, they've just not been able to push back. All the science I've seen says that if you have an N95 mask fitted for you together with other PPE, such as face shields, booties, gowns, and gloves, together these things can be helpful for individuals in the medical context to not only not spread, but to not have splatter, so on and so forth, in the communication of disease. And these things need to be changed regularly. But that the utilization of non-medical grade materials, non-N95, cotton masks, is not only ineffective, it actually reverses and can be damaging to the individual engaging in the behavior. We've all seen it. Every single one of us has seen it. You've seen the people with the mask down here, gaps on the side. Those things are completely ineffective. They're doing nothing other than catching bacteria and allowing you to then, when you touch it all the time, re-ingest it. They're doing nothing for you whatsoever. They're not protecting you. They're not protecting anybody else. We have medical studies. The CDC in May of 2020 published an article demonstrating that cotton masks over against the N95, cotton masks had a 97% penetration rate, and that those who wore cotton masks had a 40% higher infection rate than the control group. And then we had the wonderful marine experiment, which I thought was just great. If anything illustrates what's going on, this does. The Marines, over 1,000 of them, volunteer, and they wipe everything down, and they disinfect everything, and they had Marine drill sergeants. They brought Sergeant Carter back from the dead to make sure that these volunteers are doing everything they're supposed to do, and they double masked them. They double masked them. Just like what you've got now. Double masked them. Military discipline. The Marines, for crying out loud. And the group that they studied with the double masked had a slightly higher infection rate than the control group once again. Live not by lies. These things don't do what they're advertised to do, and in fact, there's a lot of people who believe that they have greatly deleterious effects as well. And so the question really isn't what is the relationship of church and state here. The question is, what is a lie? What if they start saying wear 2 masks? There are already asthmatics that are suffering greatly because, let's be honest, even though you're supposed to have medical exemptions, no one cares. No one cares a bit about medical exemptions. What are you supposed to do? Put the asthmatic in 2 masks? It's a good way to kill them. They can't survive that. What if they say you need 3? We literally have situations right now where people are saying, even after you get these new vaccines, you'll still have to wear a mask and you'll still have to social distance. So the question then becomes, when are you living according to a lie? When does this simply become a sign of your submission? And what's next? Well, we all know what's next, don't we? Everyone listening to me knows what's next. Anyone with, well, okay, I'll take that back. I think anyone in their heart knows what's next. But there are a lot of people who are unwilling to follow the logic to its conclusion. You know that vaccinations will be made mandatory. They'll be mandatory for travel. They'll be mandatory for schools. They'll be mandatory for employment. They'll be mandatory to do anything in culture. And there are already a number of Western states and Western countries that have made it very clear that the police can vaccinate you, that they can force these untested, no ability to know what they're going to do in 2 years or 5 years, genetically engineered vaccines into your body. That's what'll come next. What'll come after that? Well, they won't want to do anything after that. Really? When do you say no to tyranny? When do you say no to tyrants? Is it a good thing to force people to ingest into their bodies substances that they in their conscience do not believe to be good for them. That they have absolutely firm and proper reason to say, this is not good for me. I am unconvinced in my conscience that this is safe. That's what's next. And once you collapse on that, all of your autonomy is done. And I mean autonomy in the good sense of liberty. Autonomy to do what's right before God, to act on the basis of his revelation. So the question is, how often has this subject been treated as part of the overall movement that we are observing? And how often has it been cut off and it's only this issue over here? It's just this masking issue. It's not about what the government's doing anyplace else. We don't have to consider that. No, we do have to, if we're wise, consider, are these mandates part of an overall demand upon Christian people to compromise their principles in many areas? And that's where we've come down. That's where we've come down. I think time is going to demonstrate that we have only begun this process. We have only started in regards to this process. So there's much more I could say about that. I thought about doing an entire show where we bring back all the data and all the articles and go back over all of these things. But to be honest with you, right here, oh, hello, that even made it bigger. Double masking makes common sense and is likely more effective. We didn't know that in March? We didn't know that 3 months ago? What about the diminishment? What about the fact that makes it harder to breathe? What about any of this stuff? A lot of us are going, hey, there's, come on, guys. This is becoming pretty obvious that y'all seem to be making this up as you're going along. Making this up as you're going along.